I didn't write it. I swear to God I didn't write it. But my name changed on the page. It's my signature, but it says I checked into this shelter on May 29th. Today is only the 28th, and the pencil lead is still warm. It's coming back for the book. It's right outside the overhang. Settle in, pull the blankets close, and let the static fade as we journey into the deepest, unmapped hollows of the mountains. Welcome back to the Redacted Archives. There is a particular kind of silence that lives only on high ridges, not the comfortable silence of an empty house, not the gentle silence of a sleeping neighborhood. This is something older and heavier, something that presses down against your shoulders and sits behind your eyes. It is the silence of a mountain that has decided, quietly and without any announcement, that it no longer wishes to be observed. Our hiker, a man named Daniel, a seasoned man, a man who had spent the better part of 20 years walking the long green spine of the Appalachian Range, knew that silence well. He had felt it before, in lesser degrees, on lesser days, but he had never felt it like this. Not quite like this. Not with this particular weight to it, this particular texture, like something pressing its full attention against the back of his neck and simply holding it there, patient and unblinking. He had set out from the trailhead at first light on the morning of May 28th, the kind of gray, bruised dawn that smells of iron and wet soil, the kind that makes the inside of your lungs feel heavy and cold with every breath you pull. The forecast had been cautious but not alarming. Some low cloud cover, they said. Possible reduced visibility above 4,000 feet. Typical late spring mountain weather. Nothing that would slow a man of his experience. The fog came up from the valley like something patient and deliberate. Not rolling in the way storm weather rolls, not driven by wind or pressure. It simply rose, the way water fills a vessel, slow and inevitable, filling every low hollow first, then climbing the gullies, then spreading across the ridge line itself, until the ancient hemlocks disappeared to their waists, then their shoulders, then their crowns, until there was nothing left of the forest but gray, a deep, featureless, breathing gray that carried the smell of old bark and cold pine resin, and something else beneath that, something Daniel could not name, something like turned earth in a place where nothing should be turning. He had slowed his pace considerably by mid-morning. The white paint blazes on the trail trees were his only guidance now, each one a small rectangular ghost appearing out of the murk ahead of him and vanishing again behind him as he passed. He counted them the way a man in open water counts his strokes. One blaze, another, another. A quiet, rhythmic counting that kept the mind tethered when the world had lost all its edges. The forest had gone entirely silent by then. No birds. Not a single one. No insects. No rustle of small, unseen things in the underbrush. The only sound in the entire wide world was the dull, heavy thud of his own boots against the trail, the soft creak of his pack straps settling with each step, the faint, rhythmic swing of the carabiner clipped to his left shoulder strap, and the slow, almost thoughtful sound of his own breathing moving through the cold air and vanishing into the white. He had read somewhere in a battered field guide he kept on his shelf back home that mountain animals grow still and quiet before certain weather events, before heavy pressure changes, before something moves through their territory that is large enough and patient enough to make them press flat against the ground and wait for it to pass. He had never given that particular passage much thought. He thought about it now. He thought about it with considerable attention. The shelter appeared when he was nearly upon it. It materialized out of the white wall of fog the way old things materialize, gradually, without drama, but with a weight that the eye takes a moment to fully process. 3 weathered walls of gray-brown wood, silvered and softened by decades of mountain rain. A low, corrugated metal roof darkened with years of rain and pine pollen and the accumulated rust of 100 wet seasons. The open face looked out over what should have been a long, sweeping view of the valley below, but which was now nothing more than a flat, solid wall of absolute white. The shelter was perhaps 12 feet deep and 8 feet wide, just deep enough that a man could lie down in the dry interior and feel the cold air moving past the open mouth without it reaching him. Daniel stepped up under the overhang and shrugged his pack from his shoulders and let it settle against the back wall with a dull, heavy thump that seemed very loud in the silence. He stood for a moment at the open edge, one hand on the rough support post, the wood cold and faintly damp beneath his palm, the grain of it raised and splintered with age, and looked out into the fog. There was nothing to see. There was nothing out there at all, just the white, and the slow, almost breathing movement of it as it rolled past the shelter opening in long, patient pulses, as if the mountain itself were exhaling. He turned back to the interior. The shelter smelled of old wood and mildew and the ghost of a dozen campfire meals from seasons past. The floor was bare planking, worn smooth in the center by the passage of many boots, and cold enough that Daniel could feel it through the rubber soles of his hiking boots when he shifted his weight. In the far left corner, fixed to the wooden wall by a loop of rusted wire at chest height, was the metal-capped PVC container, the standard trail register tube, a fixture of every AT shelter from Georgia to Maine. White plastic, maybe 12 inches long, the cap secured with a quarter turn to keep the moisture out. The wire holding it had bled a long brown streak of rust down the wood beneath it, like a very old and very slow wound. Daniel knew the rule of the register without having to think about it. Every serious hiker did. You signed in. You wrote your name, your hometown, your date of entry, and your intended destination. You did it so that if something happened, if you slipped on a wet rock face, if the fog closed down completely and the blazes ran out, if you simply vanished into the unmapped void between one shelter and the next, search and rescue would know where you had last been standing. It was a record of your presence on the mountain, proof that you had passed through this particular point in time and space and left your name behind you, like a stone marker on the trail. He crossed the shelter floor and worked the cap free with cold, stiffened fingers. Inside, rolled and somewhat damp at its outer edge, was the registration notebook. A standard composition book, its cover soft with humidity, its pages wavy at the corners from repeated wetting and drying. He shook it gently free of the tube and opened it to the current month's entries, flipping slowly to find today's date, May 28th. He ran his finger down the column of entries, reading names and hometowns in the lazy, comfortable way hikers read logbooks. Not for information exactly, but for the simple, reassuring proof that other human beings had stood in this same spot, breathed this same cold air, felt this same damp wood beneath their fingertips, and moved on safely down the mountain. It was a ritual as old as the trail itself, a small, quiet handshake across time. He found the most recent entry, and his fingers stopped. The handwriting above the blank line for his own entry was his. Not similar to his, not in the same general style, his. The particular cramped pressure of his capital letters, the way his lowercase e looped slightly too far to the left, the exact habitual way he wrote the name of the small Kentucky town where he'd been born and raised for 38 years. Every mark of it was his. The pressure of the graphite, the slight leftward lean he'd never fully corrected since childhood, the small habit he had of pressing harder on the downstroke of the letter D at the start of his name, so that first letter was always a shade darker than everything that followed it. It said his name, his full name, his hometown. And then, in the cramped margin beside it, a note he did not remember writing and could not have written because he had only just arrived. Shouldn't have looked back on the ridge. It's right behind me now. The date beside the entry was May 29th. Tomorrow. Daniel stood very still. His breathing had gone shallow and deliberate, the way breathing goes when the body is quietly deciding whether to act or stay absolutely motionless. The cold of the shelter floor came up through his boots. The damp smell of the notebook rose from the open pages. A single drop of condensation, loosened from some crack in the shelter roof above him, fell and struck the page directly atop the graphite of that final line, spreading it, smearing the period at the end of the word now into a soft gray bloom across the paper. The lead was still warm from the pencil. He understood then, in the slow, cold, descending way that true understanding sometimes arrives, that by standing here and reading it, by letting his eyes move across those words and confirm them, he had done something. He could not have said precisely what. He could not have explained the mechanism of it. But the understanding was absolute and physical, the way the understanding of a misstep on a cliff edge is absolute and physical. He had seen the entry. He had recognized it as his own. He had looked at tomorrow's date and known it for what it was. And by knowing it, by pressing his thumb to that wet page and feeling the warmth of fresh graphite against his skin, by standing in this shelter on May 28th and bearing silent witness to the record of May 29th, he had placed himself inside the timeline. He had closed something that might have otherwise remained open. He set the notebook very carefully on the shelter floor. And then, from somewhere out in the white, the sound began. It was not a loud sound. It was, in its way, almost gentle. A long, slow, rhythmic drag across the trail surface. The texture of it was the texture of dead branches, dozens of them lashed together, sweeping in a wide arc across the packed earth and loose stone of the mountain path, like a broom, like something enormous sweeping the walk before a house of considerable size. Back and forth, slow and patient, left and then right, left and then right, each pass taking 4 or 5 full seconds to complete, followed by a pause of equal length, followed by the return stroke, followed by another pause. Utterly without urgency, utterly without hesitation, Daniel moved to the edge of the shelter and looked out into the fog. He could see the trail below the shelter platform where the path curved around the base of the ridge. Or rather, he could see where the trail had been, because the footprints he had made coming up that final approach, the deep, clear impressions of his boot soles in the soft earth, impressions that should have been plainly visible in the disturbed soil, were gone, smoothed away. The earth there was unbroken and clean, as if no one had walked it in a very long time, as if the trail had been tended, maintained, returned carefully to a state of perfect blankness. He watched as the sweeping moved closer. He could not see the source of it clearly. The fog was too complete, too absolute. But he could see the motion of it, the wide pendulum arc of something massive passing back and forth across the trail, erasing the path behind it as it came forward. And he could see, as it passed the nearest blaze tree on the left side of the trail, that the white paint rectangle that should have been there, that had been there, that he had seen there not 40 minutes ago, was gone as well. The bark beneath it was smooth and unmarked, as if the blaze had never been painted, as if no trail authority had ever taken a brush to this tree, as if he had never passed this way, as if there was no record anywhere on this mountain that Daniel had ever set foot on it at all. The sweeping sound moved up the trail toward the shelter with the patience of something that has never once been in a hurry and has never once needed to be. It did not rush. It did not accelerate. Every slow arc of that massive broom was exactly as wide and exactly as deliberate as the one before it. There was a rhythm to it that was almost restful if you did not think carefully about what the rhythm meant. Left and then right. A pause of 4 or 5 seconds. Left, and then right again. And with every pass, the white of the fog at the shelter's open face seemed to deepen and thicken, the way smoke thickens in a sealed room, until the opening of the shelter felt less like a doorway and more like the face of a wall. The fog thickened at the shelter's open face until it was no longer fog but simply white, a total featureless white, the kind that makes the eye feel as if it has stopped functioning altogether, as if the optic nerve has sent its last signal and is now simply resting in the dark behind the skull. The shelter interior felt very small. The 3 wooden walls pressed in from behind, their grain rough and cold and faintly yielding where decades of moisture had softened the wood. The white pressed in from the front. And in the space between, Daniel stood without moving, without making a sound, with the smeared and dampened registration notebook open on the floor at his feet, and the rusted wire loop of the PVC container swaying very slightly in the cold, disturbed air. The sweeping stopped. It stopped directly at the edge of the wooden platform. Not on the platform, not at the tree line, at the exact seam where the mountain trail met the edge of the shelter floor, at the precise boundary between the mountain's territory and the small square of dry planking that a person might reasonably call shelter. The white fog in the open face of the shelter was perfectly still, and then a hand appeared in it, long, gray, the color of weathered fence posts and old pine bark and the flat stones that line a dry creek bed after a long summer. The knuckles were very large, and the fingers were very thin, and they moved with the slow, considered ease of something that has all the time there is and has never once been asked to account for any of it. It did not reach for Daniel. It did not grab or claw or clutch. It simply extended into the frame of the shelter opening, and with one deliberate, unhurried tap of a single extended finger, it struck the side of the metal-capped PVC container where it hung on its rusted wire loop against the shelter wall. The container swayed. The rusted wire sang one thin, quiet note. The hand withdrew back into the white and was gone. The fog held the shelter completely on all sides now, above, below, in every direction that was not made of wood and old rust and cold planking underfoot. Outside there was no trail. There were no blazes on the trees. There were no footprints in the soft earth of the mountain path. There was no record in the logbook or on the land itself that anyone had come this way today. There was only one entry remaining in the damp composition book lying open on the shelter floor, written in a familiar, cramped hand, bearing tomorrow's date, with a margin note that had already been read, already been confirmed, already been pressed into the timeline by a pair of cold and frightened human hands that should not have touched it. And somewhere in the deep, unmapped white of the Appalachian Ridge, the sweeping did not start again. It simply waited. Entry 4, mile 92 on the ridge. I didn't check the tree canopy before I pitched the tent. I thought it was just a low-hanging branch scraping the nylon in the wind. But branches don't have fingers. It's pushing down against the fabric right now, molding its face into the ceiling. It's trying to see if I'm awake. If you're out here tonight, if you feel the nylon touch your forehead, don't open your eyes. Now, let me tell you how it started. There are rules to the backcountry that aren't written in any guidebook. They don't put 'em on the trail maps. They don't laminate 'em and nail 'em to the post at the trailhead. Not alongside the bear canister requirements and the fire restrictions and the reminder to pack out what you pack in. These are older rules, passed down in the way that old things get passed down. Not spoken directly, but implied, told sideways, embedded in the silence that falls around a fire when someone starts a sentence they don't finish. One of those rules is this: when the mountain tells you to stop, you stop. You stop and you find shelter, proper shelter. The kind the trail maintains for exactly that purpose. 3 sides of old wood and a tin roof and a packed dirt floor, set back from the ridgeline just far enough to break the worst of the wind. Not beautiful, not comfortable, but designated, intentional. Built by people who understood something about these ridges that most modern hikers have forgotten entirely. I understood it. I had walked this trail before. Not the whole of it, not end to end, but enough sections over enough years that I knew the way mountains talk to a person who's paying attention. And on that particular October evening, the mountain was talking very plainly. The storm came up from the southwest, the way storms always do in that part of the Appalachians. Not gradually, not with the slow theatrical build-up of a coastal system, but suddenly and completely, the way a curtain drops. 1 hour it was cold and clear, that particular cold that carries the smell of iron and wet stone. The sky holding that deep bruised color it gets in late autumn just after the sun drops behind the ridge. And the next hour, the wind had a voice and the rain was horizontal, and the temperature had fallen another 8 degrees in the time it took me to pull on my rain shell. I had 3 miles to the shelter. 3 miles in that country, at that hour, in that weather, is not 3 miles the way you might imagine it, sitting somewhere warm and dry. 3 miles on a ridge trail in the driving rain at full dark is a negotiation. Every footfall is a question. Every root and exposed stone is slick with something that reflects your headlamp wrong, makes distances dishonest. Your pack shifts, your poles slip. Your core temperature is dropping even as your legs are working hard. Your body spending heat it doesn't have surplus of. I had been on the trail for 11 days. My knees had opinions. My left shoulder, where the pack strap had worn a soft, persistent bruise over the collarbone, had a very loud opinion. My feet, I won't say what my feet thought, because I don't like to dwell on it. So when I came down off a small knob and found myself standing in the shelter of a thick grove of old hemlocks, their canopy so dense that the rain barely penetrated, the ground beneath them almost dry compared to the open ridge above, I made the decision that tired people make. The wrong one. The easy one. I told myself the storm would pass by midnight. I told myself the shelter was 3 miles and change, that the trail from here dipped into a hollow with 2 stream crossings, and in that rain those crossings were going to be ugly and cold and potentially dangerous in the dark. I told myself I was being smart, prudent, that there was nothing wrong with a designated wilderness campsite, with hammock trees and flat ground, even if the flat ground I'd found wasn't technically that. I told myself the hemlock canopy was shelter enough. I got the tent up in 12 minutes. I've done it faster, but the ground here was threaded with surface roots, and I had to move around a little to find a site where the footprint would lay flat. I ended up with the tent positioned lengthwise between 2 of the oldest hemlocks, their trunks maybe 15 feet apart, their lower branches beginning perhaps 8 feet up and lacing together overhead into a ceiling of dark, wet needles. The rhododendron grew thick on 3 sides, their leathery leaves holding water in great shaking drops that fell in irregular percussion onto the rainfly. I ate cold food. I didn't have the energy or the patience for the stove. I drank 2 cups of water, stripped to my base layer, pulled the sleeping bag up to my chin, and let myself feel how exhausted I truly was. The rain was loud on the fly, but rhythmic, consistent. I've always found that sound comforting, like white noise with intention. The tent was warm with my body heat, and outside the world was cold and dark and wet, and inside I was horizontal, and that was enough. I was asleep in under 4 minutes. I woke at some point. I didn't check the time, not yet, to a feeling more than a sound, a subtle change in the acoustic environment of the tent. The rain was still falling, but the ceiling had changed pitch slightly, a lower, less crisp sound. I opened my eyes in the dark and looked up. The tent ceiling was sagging, not catastrophically, not dramatically. A gentle, shallow depression, maybe 6 inches across, centered roughly above my sternum. I lay there looking at it for a moment and thought, pooling water. The fly was catching rain, and the angle of the pitch wasn't quite right, and there was accumulation. I'd need to go out and adjust the guy lines, redistribute the tension. I told myself I'd do it in the morning. I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, maybe 20 minutes later, maybe an hour, I genuinely couldn't say, there were two shallow depressions, both roughly the same size as the first, set approximately 18 inches apart. I stared at them. The rain had not slackened, and the wind, if anything, had increased slightly. And it came to me, lying there in my bag, that rain accumulates. It gathers in one low point. It doesn't form two separate equal pools side by side unless something is creating two separate points of pressure from outside. I told myself, branches, the hemlocks overhead. A low branch had sagged under the weight of rain and needles and was now resting on the fly in two places. That happened. That was a thing that happened. I watched the two depressions for a while. They didn't move. I closed my eyes. When I opened them the third time, I checked my watch. 2:17 in the morning. The rain had changed character. Slightly lighter, but steadier, if that makes sense. More patient. Like it had settled in for the long work of the night and stopped showing off. The ceiling had changed. The two depressions were still there, but they had shifted. They had moved approximately 4 inches to the left toward the wall of the tent. Not toward the foot of the head, but laterally, in a direction that no pooling water moves, in a direction that no branch dragged by wind would move, because the wind was coming from the northwest, and the movement had been to the south. They moved against the storm. I lay completely still. I am going to ask you to understand what it means to be completely still in a moment like that, inside a tent, inside a storm, inside a wilderness so complete that there is no human light in any direction for miles and miles. Your hearing becomes enormous. Your skin becomes a single listening organ. You feel your own heartbeat in places you normally don't. In the roof of your mouth, behind your eyes. I felt the ceiling. There was a third depression now, forming slowly, not appearing suddenly, but building the way a thumbprint builds when you press slowly into soft clay. Long and narrow. It was a distance below the first two that, if you were measuring, if you were making a map of it without wanting to, you would say was consistent with a chin, below a nose, below two eyes. I did not allow myself to finish that thought completely. I allowed myself to stop at the factual observation that there were 3 depressions in my tent ceiling, and that they had moved, and that the movement was directional and intentional and slow. And I allowed myself to understand the implications of those facts without putting a name to them. Not yet. Because here is the thing about the tent. Here is the thing that kept me motionless in that sleeping bag with my hands flat at my sides and my jaw locked and my eyes open. Because I had by then understood something fundamental about what was happening above me. The tent was not being torn. The tent was not being breached. Whatever was on the other side of that nylon fly was not trying to get through the material. It was using the material. It was pressing itself down into the fabric the way a sculptor presses into medium, using the resistance and give of the nylon to explore a shape, to try on a form. The fabric was the boundary, and the boundary was the only thing that made the thing on the other side of it provisional, incomplete, still becoming rather than arrived. I understood, without evidence, without logic, purely in the way that the body understands things that the mind refuses to process quickly, that if I unzipped that door, if I reached for the zipper pull that was 12 inches from my left hand, if I cut the nylon with the knife clipped inside the mesh pocket above my shoulder, if I in any way broke the physical boundary of that fabric shell, I would be removing the last condition that kept the shape outside of it from being fully, finally, irreversibly present with me in the dark. The face pressed lower. The ceiling came down in the outline of something vast and flat and wide. A face with a proportional logic that was not quite human. The distance between the eyes too great, the jaw too long, the whole of it too large, as if the architecture of a face had been understood in theory but never quite practiced. The nylon was maybe 4 inches from my nose. I could see the texture of it. I could feel the cold radiating from wherever the thing pressed. A cold that was not the cold of the rain night outside, but something more specific, more directed, like cold that knew where it was going. I breathed in the smallest way I could manage. I did not move. I want you to understand the discipline of that. Hours, and it was hours, because I watched the minutes on my watch and the tiny glow I allowed myself, the faintest tilt of my wrist. Hours of absolute stillness while something enormous and patient and wholly inhuman pressed its vast, flat approximation of a face against the only thing between us. Testing, listening for the sound of breath that would tell it I was awake, feeling for the shift of weight that would tell it I was aware, waiting for the involuntary flinch, the startled gasp, any confirmation that I knew it was there and had chosen to respond. Because that was what it wanted. Not entry precisely, not violence precisely. It wanted acknowledgement. It wanted to be seen. And in the being seen, in that awful moment of recognition, something would have been completed between us that I am deeply grateful was never completed. Somewhere around 4:40 in the morning, and I know the time because I watched it. I counted the minutes. I did not sleep. I barely breathed. The pressure began to ease. Not quickly, not with any drama, With the same terrible patience it had arrived with, the face began to lift. The depressions in the ceiling became shallow, then shallower, then were simply the natural settling of nylon around tent poles in the rain. The cold lifted. The peculiar silence that had gathered underneath the storm, a silence beneath the sound, a held breath quality to the air, slowly released. By 5:15 the rain had nearly stopped. By 5:40 I could see the gray beginning in the eastern sky through the mesh of the inner tent wall. I did not unzip the door until there was enough light to see my hands clearly. And when I stepped out, there was nothing. Wet hemlock needles, saturated ground, the drip of remaining water from the rhododendron, the ordinary sacred mess of a mountain morning after a hard night. I broke camp in 11 minutes. I walked the 3 miles to the shelter in the gray morning light, and I sat on the wooden floor and ate a hot breakfast. And I did not speak to the 2 other hikers who were there, because I didn't have the words yet for what I needed to say. I've thought about how to say it since then, and this is the best I have managed. If you sleep on the high ridges, and some of you will, some of you reading or listening to this are exactly the kind of person who ends up on those trails, in those conditions, making those decisions. There is one rule I want you to carry with you. Not the rules about bear hangs or water treatment or the 10 essentials. This one. Check the canopy before you pitch. Look up. Really look. Not for widowmakers, not for dead wood. Look at the shape of the branches. Look at whether the limbs overhead are the kind that could reach you. Look at whether the space between the tree and your tent feels like empty air or like something that has been waited in before. And if, in the deep watch of the night, you feel the ceiling of your tent come down, if you feel that cold, that pressure, that particular searching weight against the nylon above your face, don't open your eyes. Don't open the door. Don't give it the one thing it came all that way for. Just lie still. Breathe small. Wait for the gray. The gray always comes. Sleep well now. You're safe where you are. Warm. Still. The ceiling above you is just a ceiling. The sounds outside your window are just the ordinary sounds of the night, doing what night does. Settling, breathing, moving on. Whatever's out on those ridges tonight, it's a long way from you. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders drop. You made it through another one. If this story found you at the right moment, if it scratched that particular itch that only a good slow burn can reach, I'd love to know. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight. Tell me if you've ever had a night on the trail that felt a little too quiet, a little too close. I read every single one, and some of your stories are better than mine. And if you want more nights like this one, more slow dark, more patient dread, more of the kind of fear that lets you sleep rather than keeps you from it, then subscribe. Hit that button and let the algorithm know you're one of us. New stories come regular as the weather up here, and I'd hate for you to miss the next one. We've got more ridges to walk, more dark to sit with together. But that's for another night. Don't light the flashlight. Just listen. It's against the back logs again. That's the fourth notch it's carved since the fire died. And we only have 3 miles left to the gap. It's cutting away our path home. There is a place, somewhere between the static and the dark, where old stories settle like sediment into cold mountain water, where the things that happened once upon a trail go down quiet and stay down quiet and wait to be remembered. This is one of those stories. Come in close. Breathe easy. There is nothing to do but listen. Welcome to the Redacted Archives. It started the way most terrible things start, with a small decision made in the afternoon light that seemed like no decision at all. He'd been walking since just past 6 that morning. His name isn't important. What matters is the pack on his back. 43 pounds of it, and the white blaze painted on the tree ahead of him, and the way his left knee had been talking to him in a low, persistent voice since around mile 9. The trail does that. It finds the weakest thing in you and converses with it, quietly, all day long, until you can't hear much else. He'd been aiming for the shelter at Cutter's Notch. He'd read about it in a dog-eared trail guide found at a hostel in town, and the name had snagged in his mind the way cloth catches on a nail. Sharp, unexpected, difficult to pull free. The guide said it was a 3-sided lean-to, weathered but standing, approximately 16 miles from the nearest road crossing. Remote, quiet, rarely used after summer season. He'd copied the coordinates into his trail journal in careful strokes and told himself it was a destination. What he did not do, and this is the part that matters, the part that lives under everything else in this story like roots beneath frozen ground, was pay attention to the markings on the trees in the 2 miles before the shelter turnoff. He had seen them. He would tell you that plainly. Cut into the bark of old yellow birches along the upper switchback, just where the trail bends hard left and the ground drops away into a long valley of hemlock and white pine. Shallow cuts, notches, 5 in a row on one tree, spaced in a way that seemed deliberate and unhurried, the white inner wood barely showing through the gray bark. He had slowed, reached out and touched the nearest cut, feeling the roughness of fresh wood against his fingertip. This week recent, maybe closer. He had thought, kids probably, a hunter, someone with a knife and too much time. He had not thought about the legend. He hadn't known the legend then. That would come later, in the shelter, in the dark, from an old thru-hiker named Marta, who pressed her back against the near wall and told it in a voice so low he'd had to lean in to hear it over the fire. But that is getting ahead of things. By the time afternoon had started its slow collapse into evening, the fog had begun. It came from the east, which is unusual. Fog on these ridges usually rolls in from the west. But this fog came from the east, slipping between the trees like something with patience and intent. He watched it come while eating trail crackers at a flat rock near a creek crossing, watched it fill the gaps between the hemlocks on the far bank, and felt the first true chill of the day settle into the back of his neck. Not the comfortable chill of exertion cooling, the other kind. The kind that doesn't go away when you zip up your fleece. He had another 4 miles to the shelter. He could have turned back, retraced to the road crossing, set up his bivvy bag near the second creek, waited for morning. He knew this. But there is something in a person that mistakes forward motion for safety. that believes if you keep walking, you'll eventually walk through the trouble and out the other side. He had that thing in him. He just hadn't been shown what it cost. The last light went somewhere around 7. Not dramatically. It simply withdrew. Politely. One moment there was a gray, gauzy light through the wet canopy. The next there was only the narrow cone of his headlamp, and everything else was black. Not the friendly black of a room you know well. The territorial black of old-growth forest, which has its own weight and temperature and presses against the edge of your light like something curious and unconcerned. He found the shelter by the reflective blaze marker and followed the blue-blazed side trail down a short, steep pitch to the clearing where the lean-to stood. Marta was already there. She was perhaps 65, perhaps older. Silver-white hair in a loose braid, and a face lined and deeply calm. The kind of calm that isn't the absence of fear, but something built on top of it over a long time. She was feeding the small fire ring with methodical movements, laying each piece of wood as though placing something fragile. She looked up when he came in and said, "You're late." He said he knew. She said, "You saw the marks on the birches, up on the switchback." He set his pack down on the right-hand platform and looked at her across the fire. He said, "I saw some cuts." "Yeah." She was quiet for a while. Then she told him about the notch cutter. She told it the way you tell something you've carried for years, without drama, with the flatness of a thing you've stopped trying to disbelieve. The old-timers along this section of trail, she said, the ridge runners, the shelter maintainers, the families who'd farmed these coves going back 5 generations, they didn't talk about it much to outsiders, but they all knew it. The way they knew which streams ran dry in August and which game trails not to follow after dark. It comes to the shelters, she said, the open front ones, not the cabins, the lean-tos. The ones where there's nothing between you and the outside world but 3 walls and whatever you brought with you. It comes to the back wall, the exterior side. You won't see it. The fog is where it lives, or what it wears, or what it is. But you'll hear it. If the fire has died enough, if the night is quiet enough. Carving, she said, into the backlog of the shelter wall. Counting down, she said. Not days, not years, miles. The miles of clear thinking you have left before the trail stops making sense, before the white blazes lead you in circles, before the map and the ground come apart like wet paper. It measures something in you and takes it away, one notch at a time. And when the last notch goes down, You walk out into the dark, and you don't come back. She said this last part very quietly. The fire was low by then. He told himself it was folklore, trail mythology, the kind that accumulates in remote places the way moisture accumulates on cold stone. Natural, inevitable, not evidence of anything. He told himself this with some conviction, lying in his sleeping bag on the right-hand platform, listening to the fog settle against the open face of the shelter like slow, patient breathing. He did not tell himself this for very long. The first scrape came at what he guessed was 11 o'clock. He had been drifting, that shallow, unreliable drifting that passes for sleep when you're cold, and listening even when you don't mean to be. The fire was embers. Marta was a still shape across the shelter, breathing in the long, measured rhythm of actual sleep. And he heard it, quieter than he'd expected. He'd been braced for something loud, something clearly external and wrong. Instead, what he got was something almost indistinguishable from the settling of old wood in cold air. Almost, except that wood settles in single random ticks, and this was sustained, deliberate, rhythmic. A drawing sound, something moving along the grain of timber in a slow, considered line, pausing and moving again, like someone who had done this many times before and saw no reason to hurry. The back wall of the lean-to was perhaps 8 inches from the back edge of the sleeping platform. 8 inches of old hand-hewn timber between the inside of the shelter and whatever was outside it. He lay perfectly still and felt those 8 inches in a way he had never felt physical space before, as both infinitely thin and impossibly vast, as a distinction between two states of being that had suddenly become fragile beyond any reasonable reassurance. He did not move. He did not call out. He did not light his headlamp. He breathed. The scraping went on for perhaps a minute, and stopped. The silence that followed was the loudest thing he had ever heard. The fog, when he finally dared click his headlamp on briefly and point it outward, could not be penetrated beyond 4 or 5 feet. Just gray. Just the breathing, featureless gray. Marta said without turning over, "First one." He said, "What?" She said, "That was the first one. Go back to sleep if you can." He could not. The second notch came perhaps an hour later, though time had become unreliable, elastic in the way it gets in the deep hours of a sleepless night outdoors, where 10 minutes feels like an age and an hour collapses into nothing. The sound was the same, deliberate, patient, the slow, careful language of something that understood grain and timber and the precise pressure required to cut clean without splitting. a craftsman's sound. That was the worst part, that it sounded like craft, like whatever was pressed against the back wall was not acting from malice or frenzy, but from terrible, focused intention. After the second notch, the fog tightened. He was sure of it. A thickening at the open face of the shelter that made the darkness feel closer and more deliberate. The smell changed, too. The clean, cold scent of rain-wet pine shifting toward something older and deeper. Something that reminded him, without logical basis, of turned earth. He ran the calculation over and over. 3 miles to the road gap. 3 miles of trail through fog so thick he could not see his hand at arm's length, in the black, with nothing to follow but the white blazes on the trees. And Marta had said, that's what the notches count down. The miles of clear thinking you have left before the blazes stop making sense, before the trail folds back on itself and leads you somewhere the map has no name for. The third notch came. He counted afterward, without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, and the trail back to the gap was 3 miles long. He thought about that correspondence for a long time, lying still in the dark. He thought about the marks on the birches, 5 in a row, and wondered who had lain in this shelter before him, how many nights it had taken, what they had done when the last notch came down. The fog was inside the shelter now, not fully, not visibly, but he could feel it on his face, feel the cold deepening, feel the last of the embers go from dull orange to nothing, as though even that small warmth had been quietly, carefully discouraged. The smell of damp pine pitch was strong, the smell of cold stone, the smell of old wood slowly yielding to patient work. He did not run, not as boast, not as confession, as fact. He understood, in the deep, wordless part of himself that fear sometimes opens, that running was exactly the wrong thing. The dark and the fog and the confusion were the conditions the counting down was preparing, not for something the entity would do to him, for something he would do to himself. So he stayed still. He breathed. He thought about home, the road crossing 3 miles north, his truck in the parking lot, dry clothes in the cab, a half-eaten bag of chips on the passenger seat. He thought about these things with great care and specificity, because specificity is an anchor, because the detailed and ordinary world is the rope you hold when everything else is pulling you toward the unmapped edge. The fourth notch came just before the dark began to thin. He knew it was the fourth. He'd been counting every silence since the third. And when the scraping began again, he said to himself quietly, without emotion, 4. And the open face of the shelter seemed to him at that moment not a missing wall, but a threshold, a door standing permanently open onto something with no interest in being seen, but every interest in being heard. And he pressed himself flat and felt the faint vibration of the tool working 8 inches away, and did not move. And then it stopped. The fog retreated the way a tide retreats, not from defeat, but because its cycle had run its course. The darkness went from absolute to merely deep, then from deep to the flat gray that precedes dawn on an overcast mountain morning. And the nearest trees resolved slowly out of nothing into shapes, and the shapes became trees, and he breathed out a breath he felt he'd been holding for hours. Marta was sitting up with her knees drawn to her chest, looking at the back wall. She said, "Go look." He looked. 4 notches, fresh cut into the old gray exterior timber, clean, precise, evenly spaced. The tool marks were fine and careful, the wood pale and raw at the cuts, the surrounding surface dark with age and moisture. They were, in their way, beautiful, the way terrible, careful things can sometimes be beautiful, the way anything that has taken its time carries a quiet authority. He said, "What happens when the last one goes down?" Marta pulled on her boots and laced them slowly. She looked at him with the look of someone who has carried something a long time and knows there is no good way to set it down. She said, "Nobody who's had the last one carved has ever been able to tell anyone." He nodded. She said, "We leave now, while the trail still makes sense." And they did. So now you know the story of the notch cutter and what it waits for in the fog along that remote stretch of trail in the old 3-sided shelter where the logs are ancient and the fire ring goes cold and the back wall holds the quiet record of every countin' down it has ever done. And if you ever walk that stretch, if you come to a shelter at the end of a long day with the fog rolling in from the east and a voice in the practical part of you saying there is still time to turn back, you know to listen to that voice. But you are not on that trail tonight. You are here in the warmth, with the weight of the day settling off your shoulders like a pack set down at the end of a long walk. The sounds around you are familiar sounds, safe sounds. The dark behind your eyes is a friendly dark, a dark that has held you before and will hold you again now. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift. There is nothing counting tonight, nothing keeping track, nothing pressing against the other side of any wall. There is only the slow, settling quiet of a world that has put down its work and has nothing left to do but rest. Go easy. Go slow. The trail will be there in the morning. It's matching me. It's been matching me for I don't know how long. Listen, if anyone finds this, if anyone is listening to this, you need to understand that it learned. I tried to trick it. I changed my pace. I stopped. I sped up. I even tried skipping a beat mid-stride, the way you might skip a syllable. And now it's just standing there, just outside where I can see. And every time I move a single step, I hear one click. One. Just one. Coming from the laurel to my left. And it sounds exactly like my left pole. Exactly. The drag before the plant. The flat sound of the wet tip against packed earth. Like my left. The trail guides always tell you to hike with a partner in the backcountry. Not because of the terrain, though the terrain will humble you fast enough on its own. Not because of the weather, though the weather in the southern Appalachians can turn from warm gold to cold and bitter gray inside of 20 minutes in a way that would make a flatlander weep and wonder what they ever did to deserve mountains. No, the old-timers, the ones who've been walking these ridges since before the trail had a name carved into a post at the trailhead, They'll tell you to hike with a partner because of the silence, because of what lives inside it. I want you to get comfortable now. I want you to settle back into wherever you are and let your shoulders drop away from your ears and just breathe. Because what I'm going to tell you is something that happened slowly. Something that crept the way cold air creeps under a door. So gradually you don't feel it until you're already shivering. And the telling of it ought to be slow too, so that you feel every step of it the way I felt every step of it. Every single quiet, rhythmic, solitary step. It was late September when I went up into the high ridges alone. I want you to picture the trail the way it was that morning, because the morning was beautiful in the specific, serious way that only autumn mornings deep in the Appalachians can be beautiful. The light came through the canopy in long, pale columns, the kind that look almost solid, almost like you could reach out and lay your hand flat against them and feel something push back. The leaves were just beginning to turn, that first trembling blush of orange and copper working in from the edges of each leaf inward, like the trees were being slowly illuminated from within. The air had that particular mountain autumn smell, cold stone and wet bark, and something deeper underneath it all, something older and harder to name, like the earth itself was starting to breathe inward, drawing everything slowly down toward stillness, toward the long sleep of winter. I had 2 trekking poles, which I'd used for years by then, collapsible aluminum ones with rubber-tipped ends I'd worn down to bare metal on both tips from 1,000 miles of rock and root. Every time those bare metal tips kissed the rock or the hard-packed dirt of the trail, they made a sound, a small sound, a click, clean and metallic and rhythmic, like the second hand of a good clock, or like the knitting needles of some patient old woman working through a long winter evening beside a low fire. Click, 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 click. A sound you stop consciously hearing after the first mile or so, because it becomes part of you. It becomes part of your breathing, part of your body's particular language as it moves through space, as it announces itself to the world, one small percussion at a time. The climb that day was long and unrelenting and steep. The trail switchbacked up a ridge so old that the rock faces alongside the path were draped in curtains of lichen, gray-green and thick as velvet, the kind that takes real patient decades to grow that substantial. The mud between the rocks was black and cold and smelled of iron. My thighs were burning before I'd gone a quarter mile up the serious grade, and my breath was coming hard and white in the cold air. And I fell into that particular meditative blankness that long, hard, uphill climbs produce in people who've done enough of them to stop fighting it. A beautiful bodily emptiness where thought quiets down to almost nothing, and you exist entirely in the sensation of movement, the slow burn of muscle, the press and give of boot against stone, the swing and plant of the poles. Click, 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 click. I was perhaps 2 miles into the climb, maybe a little more, when the fog began to come in off the ridge. That's common enough up there. The high ridges collect cloud the way a stone bowl collects rainwater, and by mid-morning the fog was rolling across the path in slow, thick, unhurried waves, turning the trees at the edge of the trail into dark suggestions of themselves. Not trees exactly, but the idea of trees, the shapes that trees leave behind in memory. The trail ahead of me narrowed into featureless gray. The trail behind me narrowed into the same featureless gray. I became a single moving point suspended between two curtains of white nothing, and the only sounds in all the world were my breathing and my boots and my poles. Click, 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 click. I stopped to tie my right boot somewhere around the 2nd mile marker, because the lace had worked itself loose the way laces will on a long and punishing climb, one knot slipping incrementally free with every upward step. I planted both poles firmly and bent at the waist, and the world went very, very quiet. When you've been generating that much rhythmic sound for that long, and then you suddenly stop, the silence that floods in to replace it is almost physical. You feel it press against your eardrums. I was crouched there with my fingers working the wet lace, and the fog was drifting slow and low around my ankles, like something curious. And the mountain laurel thicket that crowded in close along the left side of the trail was dark and dense and absolutely, completely still. And then, from inside it, or from just behind it, or from somewhere in that gray-green tangle of old bent wood and leathery leaves that never fully drop, one click. Not an echo. The stone face that might have sent an echo back at me was a full 40 yards behind at the last switchback. And besides, an echo doesn't wait. An echo doesn't time itself. A single, clean, metallic click, placed precisely where my left pole would have fallen if I had taken exactly one more step forward before stopping. I stayed crouched over my boot. I did not move. My fingers had gone still on the lace without deciding to. The laurel was still. The fog moved in its slow, indifferent way, curling around the dark stems near the ground. Nothing else happened. Nothing moved that I could see. I finished tying the boot. I straightened slowly and stood there with my weight on both poles, head tilted slightly, listening with the kind of attention that sharpens everything and puts a cold edge on every sound. I heard bird song somewhere far down the ridge, distant and thin. I heard the fog moving through the high canopy overhead, that faint sigh of moisture against leaves. I heard my own pulse. Nothing else. I told myself the things a person always tells themselves in a situation like that. A branch contracting in the cold, a stone settling as the frost worked out of it. The strange acoustics of the mountains, where sound bounces off rock faces and travels through hollows in ways that make distance and direction completely unreliable. I told myself all of those things, and I believed most of them, and I started walking again. Click, 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 click. What came from the laurel now was barely present, a soft half-beat behind my rhythm, faint enough that you could convince yourself it was tail-end echo if you were willing to work at the convincing. So I sped up. I want you to understand that I believed I was being practical. I was going to push the pace hard enough that whatever was producing that sound would either keep up and reveal itself or fall behind and prove itself an echo. Either way, I would know something. So I drove the poles hard into the trail and pushed my body up the steep grade at a pace that had my lungs aching within 30 seconds. A quick, sharp, urgent rhythm entirely different from the slow, meditative click I'd been maintaining all morning. And for a long, genuine, relieved moment, I heard nothing from the laurel at all. Just my own poles, just my own boots, just my own breath tearing in and out. I slowed back to my resting pace, and it came back right away, and it was closer than it had been before. I stopped completely, planted my poles hard into the dirt, and stood with my full weight on them, and held every part of myself still. From the laurel, after a silence of 2 full seconds, maybe 3, one click, soft as breath, patient as weather, and it matched exactly and completely the particular flat and slightly hollow sound that my left pole made when the tip met packed dirt rather than stone. Not a rock click, a dirt click, my dirt click. I understood it then, in the way that true understanding arrives not all at once, but in a slow, cold spreading, like water finding the low places in a floor. It had been listening. While I walked, it had been cataloging me. And when I changed my pace, when I sped up, slowed down, drove the poles hard in my urgency to test it, I had not been testing it at all. I had been educating it, handing it the full vocabulary of what I sounded like, every variation and nuance, as methodically as if I'd stood before it and demonstrated. Here is how I sound walking fast. Here is how I sound walking slow. Here is how I sound afraid. It had taken all of it in, and it had learned with a speed and accuracy that felt ancient. Not new learning, more like recognition. I started walking again, because standing still felt worse than walking. When I was still, it was still, and the quality of its stillness was something I cannot describe with precision except to say that it didn't feel like the stillness of something hiding. It felt like the stillness of something that simply preferred to let me move first. The fog thickened considerably as I climbed through the next half-mile. The laurel pressed closer on both sides now, the trail narrowing down to a corridor of cold, gray air running between two dense walls of dark, waxy, overlapping leaf. I could not see more than 8 or 10 feet into either thicket. Nothing past that short distance except darkness deepening into deeper darkness. But I could hear, and what I heard for the rest of that climb was this: my poles and something else's poles, and the two sounds had grown so nearly identical that there were entire, terrible stretches of 50 or 60 steps where I genuinely could not have told you which click was mine and which was not. My left pole, its left pole, the same flat dirt press, the same slight drag of the tip scuffing forward a half-inch before the plant, that small imperfection in my grip that I'd never even consciously noticed until something else had learned to reproduce it. It had learned the dragging, the exact imperfect signature of my fatigue. By the time I reached the ridge shelter, a small 3-sided wooden lean-to that the Trail Association keeps up there for emergencies, gray planks, weathered silver, a rusted metal roof. The fog had thickened to the point where the tree line 10 yards out had ceased to exist as anything I could see. There was the lean-to and the gray. I sat on the wooden bench and set my poles carefully against the back wall so they made no sound, and I listened. For a long time, nothing came. And then, from somewhere just past the edge of what the fog allowed me to see, from the direction of the tree line I knew was there, even though I could not see it. One click. My left pole's sound, rendered in perfect and complete detail, down to the very quality of the air around it. And then silence again. And the silence was not empty. The silence had a shape to it, a density, the way a room takes on a different quality when someone is standing just beyond the closed door. Not threatening in any active sense, not urgent, simply present, waiting with the deep, unhurried patience of something that has absolutely no reason to rush. I did not sleep in that lean-to. I sat with my spine against the rear wall, and I watched the gray outside go from the gray of deep fog to the darker gray of evening, to the near black of full mountain night. And every hour or so, steady as a clock, from just beyond the edge of where the fog swallowed the remaining light, heard it. One click. The sound of my own left pole given back to me from the dark. Patient as stone, patient as the old mountains themselves, which have been here so long and so quietly, they have no memory of being new. In the gray pre-dawn I came down. I walked at a steady, even pace, and I did not run, because running felt like an invitation to something I did not want to invite. The clicking came with me all the way down the mountain, step for step, pole for pole, neither gaining nor falling back. At the trailhead, where the gravel parking lot began and the pavement of the road was visible 50 yards out, it stopped. I did not pause to listen for it. I reached my truck, I got in, I drove. Now, I want you to let all of that settle around you, the way fog settles around an old mountain in the early hours. Soft, complete, unhurried. Find the position your body has been quietly asking for. Let your head press back into the pillow. Let your arms go loose. Let your hands open. Pull whatever is covering you a little closer up toward your chin and feel the full weight and warmth of it. That good, heavy, familiar warmth that asks nothing of you except that you stay still and let it work. The mountains are old, older than anything we have ever thought to give a name to. They were standing on these bones of stone long before anyone walked their ridges, and they will be standing long after the last trail marker is weathered down to bare, pale wood with no words left on it. And the things that live in them, the things in the deep laurel and the cold fog banks and the dark spaces between the oldest trees, they are not in a hurry. They have never been in a hurry. They learn patience the way the mountains taught everything up there. Slowly, thoroughly, and without any concern for how long it took. They click sometimes, in the gray, in the deep quiet of a ridge night, and they wait. But you are not on any ridge tonight. You are here, in the warm, in the still, and the only rhythm moving through the air around you right now is the slow, even tide of your own breathing, in and out, in and out. Let your eyes go as heavy as they want to go. Let the sounds of wherever you are move back. Settle into the soft distance, the way the sound of a trail fades into the background after the first long mile. Still there, still real, but belonging to a part of the mind that doesn't need to be awake to hold them. Somewhere up there on the high ridges tonight, the fog is rolling in off the mountain in slow waves, curling over cold stone, moving through the laurel thickets without any sound at all. And somewhere in it, patient and quiet and utterly still, something stands. But not for you. Not tonight. Tonight, you sleep. It's still on the cable. Don't let go. Whatever you do, do not let go of the cable. There's something up there in the canopy, and it's been holding this line the whole time. Welcome back to the Redacted Archives. If you're new here, find a comfortable position. Pull whatever you've got close. A blanket, a pillow, the warm press of darkness behind your eyelids. We don't ask much of you in this place, only that you listen, only that you stay still and let the story come to you, the way fog comes to a hollow, slow and patient, and filling every corner without you ever noticing it moved. Tonight we're going somewhere cold, somewhere high up in the dark body of the Appalachian Mountains, where the trail goes unmarked and the nearest paved road is a full day's walk behind you. We're going to a place where the trees are old enough to have names nobody remembers, and where the steel hardware left by trail crews to keep hikers safe can, under certain conditions, on certain nights, become something else entirely. The account that follows was submitted through the Archives contact form by a man who wished to be identified only as a former thru-hiker. He has asked that his real name be withheld. He has also asked, and this is the part that stayed with me, that we tell people not to fight the cable if it feels heavy. He was very specific about that. He said, if the tension feels wrong, if the line pulls back with something that doesn't feel like weight, you unhook your pack and you walk away. He said he learned that too late. This is his account, as faithfully as I can render it. He told us he was on day 41 when it happened. 41 days on trail. If you've never done a thru hike, that number might not mean anything to you. So let me try to translate it. By day 41, your body has been remade. not improved, remade. You wake every morning with a dull, systemic ache that lives in the joints first and migrates down into the tendons, then into the skin itself, which by that point has grown weather-dark and tight across the cheekbones. Your shoulders are calloused from the pack straps in the specific geometry of your load. Two curved ridges of hardened skin that map the weight distribution of everything you carry. The balls of your feet are like old leather. Your appetite has become something almost animal. He had been carrying a base weight of about 19 pounds out of Springer. By day 41, with water and the last of his resupply, the pack ran closer to 26. Not light. The kind of weight that by mile 15 starts talking to you, starts making its presence known in the hips and lower back. He had done 31 miles that day. He was the first to say that was a mistake in hindsight. Not the haunted kind of mistake, just the ordinary kind. The kind a tired man makes when he's behind on miles and the weather looks manageable, and he tells himself the next shelter is only another 6 or 7 in, so he might as well push. The fog had come down around mid-afternoon, somewhere on the ridge line above a gap he couldn't name on his map. It came the way mountain fog does, not as a single bank rolling in, but as a slow thickening of the air itself, the visibility cutting from a quarter mile to 50 yards to 20 in the space of about 40 minutes. By the time he was dropping off the ridge and contouring down toward the shelter, the world had narrowed to a pale white disk about 30 feet in every direction, with the trees appearing and disappearing at the edges like suggestions of trees, like the idea of trees, dark and shapeless and wet. The trail was muddy, not soft mud, the gummy, sucking kind that grabs at your boot sole and holds just long enough that you feel every step as a small labor. The leaves were down and soaked through, black and pulpy on the ground, and the smell of them was rich and rotting and cold. Above him, through the fog, he could hear, not see, water dripping from branch to branch in long chains, a slow, random percussion that followed him the last mile into camp. He arrived at the shelter at approximately 2 in the morning. He knew the exact time because he checked. He made a habit of noting things like that, arrival times and mileage, in a small weatherproof notebook he kept in the top pocket of his pack, partly for safety, partly because after enough days alone on trail, you start to attach to the small bureaucracies of record-keeping, the way they give the day a shape when everything else, the trees, the ridges, the hollow sameness of putting one foot in front of the other, starts to blur together. The shelter was a 3-sided lean-to. Older construction, he guessed. The wood had that deep gray color that comes not from paint, but from decades of weathering. And where the logs joined at the corners, the bark had long since fallen away, and the exposed wood beneath was the color of old pewter. The roof was corrugated metal, and the floor was raw timber planks with gaps between them wide enough to lose a tent stake through. At the back, the sleeping platform was elevated off the ground by maybe 18 inches, and above that the structure opened into the mountain dark. No back wall. The kind of design that prioritizes ventilation over warmth, and always feels, in the middle of the night, like an invitation left open to whatever is out there. Nobody else is in the shelter. That wasn't unusual for this section of trail in mid-October. The through hiker wave had passed weeks before, and the section hikers had mostly retreated for the season. It was just him. He dropped his pack at the edge of the platform, sat down in the wood, and let himself breathe for a moment. His headlamp was a narrow cone of white in the fog, illuminating the middle distance at about 10 yards before dissolving into nothing. He could hear the drip of water in the trees. He could hear, somewhere below him, the faint movement of what he assumed was a small creek. He couldn't hear anything else. And he would later tell us that for the first half hour in that shelter, that silence felt like the good kind. The kind that means you are finally still and the world is finally letting you rest. He ate cold. He didn't want to deal with the stove. He had some crackers and the last of the peanut butter packet and a handful of almonds, and he ate them slowly, sitting on the edge of the platform with his boot unlaced and his socks pulled off, and his feet hanging down in the air, drying. That detail, the drying feet. He mentioned it specifically, and I think it's worth noting because it tells you something about the quality of that arrival, the small private relief of it, the sense that the day's work was done and what followed was only rest. After he ate, he did what every careful backcountry hiker does before sleep. He dealt with his food. The shelter had a bare cable system on the large white oak that grew about 40 feet from the lean-to's open face. The tree was massive, 2, maybe 3 feet across at chest height, and the cable had been installed by the trail maintainers at a point high enough in the tree that the lowest hang would keep a food bag well out of reach of any bear, even a large one standing on its hind legs. The system was a simple mechanical affair. A steel cable ran up the trunk and out along a horizontal limb, threaded through a pulley that was bolted to the bark, and back down to a hand winch mounted to the trunk at about waist height. The winch was the old ratchet style, a spool of cable, a hand crank with a wooden handle worn smooth at the grip, a ratchet mechanism that locked the line so it couldn't slip back, and a small metal clip at the cable's free end where you hung the bag. He had used this type of system many times. He unclipped his food bag from the main pack, a dry bag, olive drab, about the size of a small duffel, and carried it to the base of the oak. His headlamp lit the hardware on the winch in a flat, white-gray light. The metal was surface rusted in the way mountain hardware always is, a thin, reddish skim over the iron, and the cable itself was dark with use, the individual wires slightly frayed at the clip end where the metal fatigues first. He ran his thumb along the frayed section out of habit, felt the small burr of it against his skin. He clipped the food bag to the cable end. He put his hands on the winch crank and began to turn. The line went taut immediately, the way it should, the slack running out as the cable wrapped around the spool. The ratchet made its clicking sound, a sound he knew well by then, that metronomic mechanical tick that counted the cable's progress up through the pulley and into the canopy above. He could feel the weight of the bag through the handle, could feel it translate from the cable into the crank into his palms. About 7 pounds, he estimated. About right. Then the weight changed. He felt it on the 4th or 5th full revolution of the crank. A sudden, soft increase in resistance, like something had been added to the bag. Not a jolt, not a sudden impact, just a slow, gathering pressure coming back down the line at him, working against the crank direction, as if the bag had doubled in weight between one rotation and the next. He stopped. He stood there in the dark with his hands on the crank handle, and he listened. And he looked up into the canopy where his headlamp beam traveled about 15 feet before the fog swallowed it completely. He could see the cable running up and away from the pulley, and then nothing. Just the pale, featureless wall of fog above the first fork of the tree. He told himself it was the bag catching on a branch. He told himself the cable had bound up somewhere in the pulley system, and that if he worked it back and forth a little, it would free. He told himself the wet conditions had introduced extra friction into the line. He had a reasonable explanation for everything he was feeling. He put his weight into the crank and turned it again. The resistance was still there, greater than before. The cable was vibrating now, not the fine, high-frequency vibration of a taut line in wind, but something lower, almost slow, like a pulse. He could feel it in the handle. He could feel it in his forearms. The ratchet mechanism was holding. The line was not slipping back, but every degree of rotation he gained felt contested in a way he had never felt from 7 pounds of food bag on a cable, in a way he had never felt from any weight on any cable. He turned the crank again. The resistance pushed back. He was not afraid yet. He was something earlier than afraid, a state of high attention, a watchfulness, the way you feel when something in the environment doesn't match your expectations and your mind has not yet decided what category to file the information in. He looked up again. His headlamp cut into the fog above the oak's first fork. The cable ran up into that light and out of it. He tried to follow it with his eyes, and he couldn't. The fog was too thick, and the dark above the fog was total. But something, and this is the part of the account he told us was hardest to describe, the part he kept returning to and revising the language around. Something up there shifted. He didn't hear it. He didn't see it move. He felt it through the cable. A slow, deliberate repositioning. The kind of weight shift that comes from something that is choosing to move rather than something that is being moved. He let go of the crank. The ratchet caught. The line held. He stood at the base of the oak with both arms down at his sides, and he looked up into the dark above the fog, and he tried to understand what he was looking at. His headlamp beam was a pale column in the fog. The cable ran up through that column and vanished. And then, as he stood there, the beam caught something at the very edge of its reach, the limit of the light, 20 feet up, where the fog was thickest. Something long, something pale, something that was folded against the cable in a way that didn't follow any geometry he could find a name for. It was still. He was still. The cable between them hummed very softly in the autumn air, drawn tight with whatever was holding the other end. He reached up slowly. His hand found the clip at the cable's free end, the one his food bag hung from below, and his fingers worked the gate open. He did not rush. He told us that very clearly. He did not rush, because some part of him understood, in the wordless way the body understands things before the mind catches up, that rushing would be exactly the wrong thing. He unclipped the bag, let it drop to the ground at his feet with a soft, wet sound. The tension in the cable changed immediately. Not gone, changed. As if whatever was up there had registered the loss of weight and was reassessing. He picked up the food bag. He walked back to the shelter. He did not look back. He has said since that he doesn't know if this was bravery or terror frozen into stillness, but he didn't look back. And he got onto the sleeping platform, and he lay down in his sleeping bag with his pack between him and the open face of the shelter. And he did not sleep until gray light was already coming through the fog. In the morning, the cable hung slack against the tree. The clip at the end was gone. He doesn't hike anymore. He told us he made peace with that. Some places, he said, earn their solitude. The trail goes on regardless. All 2,193 miles of it, from Springer to Katahdin. And most nights in those mountains are exactly what they look like. Cold, quiet, dark, and safe. But there are certain shelters, he says, certain trees where the hardware is older than the maintenance records, certain cable systems where something has learned the pattern of the ritual, the arrival after dark, the food bag on the clip, the sound of the ratchet counting the line up through the canopy. And whatever that something is, it is patient. It has been patient for a long, long time. So if you're out there this season, alone on some unmarked section of ridge where the fog comes in low and the trees press close, and the only sound is water moving in the dark below you, do the responsible thing. Hang your food. Follow the protocol. Clip the bag and put your hands on the crank. But if the line feels wrong, if the resistance comes back at you with something that breathes in it, something deliberate, something that is not the weight of 7 pounds of food in a dry bag, let go. Just let go and come back to the light. That's all for tonight, friends. Let the quiet back in. Let the story settle. You're in your bed. You're warm. Whatever dark hollow we just walked through together, it's behind you now. And the distance between you and those mountains is exactly as wide and safe as it needs to be. Close your eyes. Let the fog dissolve. Let the sound of the trail drain away beneath you until all that's left is your breath and the warmth and the good darkness behind your eyelids. The archives will be here when you wake. Sleep well. I thought it was another through hiker. I saw the white LED beam bouncing through the fog on the upper switchback, and I yelled out to see if they had space in the shelter. But it didn't yell back. The light just stopped swinging. It dropped flat into the dirt, and then I heard the brush breaking as it started sliding straight down the mountain toward me. There is a recording. That is how this story begins, as so many of the old ones do. Not with a campfire, not with a grandmother's warning whispered across a kitchen table smelling of wood smoke and dried apple, but with a small black digital recorder, the kind a person clips to the shoulder strap of their pack when they hike alone and want some evidence of their passing through this world. The kind a person clicks on with trembling fingers when they need to say something out loud into the dark, and there is no living soul close enough to hear them. The southern Appalachians have a particular quality at night. I want you to understand this before we go any further. If you have never stood on a high ridgeline in western North Carolina, above 5,500, maybe 6,200 feet, in the deep middle of October, in the hours past midnight, then there are things that language will only approximate. The cold is not simply cold. It is a presence. It moves inside your clothing. It finds the gap at your collar and presses against the side of your throat like a damp, deliberate hand. The fog at that elevation is not the soft, romantic mist you might imagine. It is a wall. It is a ceiling. It arrives without warning, and it turns the world into a gray corridor that shrinks your entire existence down to the small, pale circle of light your headlamp throws against the ground directly in front of your boots. And in that gray corridor, on a trail that may not see another human being for 3 or 4 days in either direction, the most comforting, most deeply reassuring thing a lone hiker can possibly see is the distant, bobbing white light of another headlamp moving through the trees. This is the vulnerability the old mountain people understood. They knew what a person's relief could make them do. I called the thing by different names depending on the county. Some said the false hiker. Some older families, the ones whose grandparents had homesteaded the hollow bottoms before the Park Service came through, used a phrase that translates loosely as the one that carries a borrowed light. The name recorded in this archive is the one that seems to have appeared most consistently in the accounts collected from shelter logs and search and rescue debriefs along a 70-mile stretch of the southern high route. They called it the Headlamp-Catcher. Let us follow the trail. Let us follow it slowly. The hiker's name does not matter to the telling of this. What matters is that she had been walking for 19 days. 19 days along a high, unmaintained route that parallels and diverges from the better-known paths, a route that demands real navigation, paper maps, a compass, and the kind of deep, accumulated confidence that only comes from having made bad decisions in the back country before and survived them. She was experienced. She was not reckless. These two facts are important to establish, because what happened to her was not the result of carelessness. The mountain was simply patient in a way that human experience cannot fully account for. By the time the events on the recording took place, she had been moving for 11 hours. The pack on her back weighed 41 pounds with water. She would tell this to the person who found her 3 days later, still sitting in the shelter, unwilling to leave it. Her voice very flat and careful and precise. 41 pounds. The shoulder straps had compressed a kind of permanent ache into the trapezius muscles on both sides of her neck. Her trekking poles had developed a slight rattle at the left carbide tip, where the collar had loosened over hundreds of miles of rocky trail. And the sound, tick, tick, tick against the stone, had become so embedded in her rhythm that she only noticed it when it stopped. She was pushing late. A storm system was moving in from the southwest, the kind that the weather radio had called significant, and she needed to reach the three-sided wooden shelter at the gap before it arrived. The shelter was a simple thing: rough-hewn boards, a sleeping platform, a metal bear box bolted to a tree nearby. But it was the only structure within 9 miles in any direction, and in a significant mountain storm, those 9 miles become something closer to a death sentence than a hike. The rhododendron on that section of ridge is among the densest in the eastern United States. This is not an exaggeration offered for effect. The rhododendron thickets along that high route form what botanists call hells, and the trail name is not borrowed from that word by accident. In daylight, they are dark tunnels of twisted, waxy-leafed branches that interlace overhead and block the sky completely. At night, at 2 a.m, with fog, they are something close to total sensory deprivation, punctuated only by the pale disk of your headlamp on the path ahead and the sound of your own breathing and the occasional low, organic groan of a tree responding to wind pressure somewhere above the canopy. The smell inside those thickets is deep and particular. Wet bark, old leaf decomposition, something faintly sulphurous from the soil. A smell that registers somewhere below conscious thought as ancient and indifferent and enormous. She was moving through a break between 2 thicket sections, a rocky, open stretch of trail that crossed a high shoulder of the ridge, when she looked across the hollow. The hollow to the east dropped away several hundred feet before rising again into a parallel ridgeline. In daylight, it would have been a view. At night, it was simply darkness. Deep, matte, total darkness, broken only by the restless movement of fog through the treetops far below. She stopped to drink water and to let her heart rate settle. And she stood there at the edge of that rocky shoulder looking east into the void. And that was when she saw it. A white LED light moving through the trees on the far ridge. She said later, in that flat, careful voice, that the relief was physical, that it moved through her chest like warmth, like the specific warmth of being found. The trail over there was not a maintained path. It was a use trail, a hunter's trace, something old and intermittent. And her first thought was simply that another experienced person was out here navigating the same storm window she was, pushing hard to reach cover. The thought of another person, any person, made the rhododendron feel less absolute, made the cold feel less deliberate, made the 41 pounds feel briefly manageable. She watched the light for a long time before she began walking again. It moved with the particular, irregular rhythm of a hiker, speeding slightly on easier ground, slowing and bobbing more dramatically as the terrain grew technical, disappearing momentarily behind dense tree trunks before reappearing. A hiker's light. A tired hiker's light, with that specific quality of movement that comes from a body that has been upright and moving for too many hours, and is running now on mechanical habit rather than genuine energy. She walked. The light on the far ridge walked with her. For an hour and 10 minutes. She noted the time. She was precise. The light kept pace. There was something enormously reassuring about this. The parallel companionship of another warm body moving through the same dark corridor at the same exhausted pace. She found herself adjusting her speed experimentally at one point, walking slightly faster for 100 yards, and the far light kept pace. She slowed, and it slowed. She told herself this was coincidence, because of course it was coincidence. The trail on that ridge had its own dictates of terrain. Another hiker would follow those dictates at their own rhythm. Parallel movement meant nothing. She came to the rocky trail junction at the gap, a wide, flat clearing where two trails crossed, marked by a weathered wooden post with arrows pointing in 4 directions, and she stopped to pull out her map and confirm she was on the correct bearing for the shelter. She crouched with her headlamp angled down at the paper, tracing the contour lines with one cold finger. And after a moment she looked back across the hollow. The far light had stopped. It was not bobbing. This was the thing she noticed first. And the noticing arrived not as alarm, but as a gentle, peripheral unease. The same quiet register you might give to a door that you were certain you had closed, and now is standing slightly open. The light was not bobbing. It hung in the trees on the far ridge, at what she estimated was roughly her own elevation, absolutely level. and it swayed very slowly with a long pendulous rhythm, left and then right and then left again. Not the bob and jerk of a human body breathing and shifting weight, not the irregular organic motion of a tired person standing still and looking around. A slow, metronomic sweep, like something swinging from a fixed point, like something that did not have a heartbeat, or a respiratory rate, or the 10,000 small, unconscious muscular corrections that keep an upright body upright. She stayed very still for a long time. She watched the light sweep left, and then right, and then left. The fog between the ridges moved in long, slow currents, and the light disappeared into it sometimes for seconds at a time, and then reappeared, still swinging at the same unhurried pace. She made the mistake that the recording captures. She made it because she was tired, and because 19 days alone at elevation does something particular to a person's need for company, and because the rational explanation, another hiker, resting, stretching, perhaps checking their own map, was so close and so available and so warm. She pressed the button on her headlamp twice, cycling it through its modes, flashing it twice at the far ridge, the universal signal, the hiker's greeting across a dark valley. She cupped her hands around her mouth and she called out across the hollow. The sound of her voice disappeared immediately into the fog. The mountains absorbed it without echo. And across the hollow, the far light, the swinging, level, pendulous light dropped, not dimmed, not clicked off in the deliberate way a person extinguishes a headlamp when they are done with it. It dropped, as though whatever was holding it at that height had simply released it, and it fell to the forest floor and went out. And then the hollow was silent in a way that it had not been silent before, because there had been sound. Beneath the wind, beneath her own breathing, the 10,000 small sounds of a living mountain at night, insects and water, and the movement of small creatures. And now those sounds were also gone. The silence was sudden and total, and it had the quality of held breath. She stood at the junction for several seconds, and then she heard it. Not footsteps. The thing did not move on the trail. It moved through the brush, off-trail, on the steep, near-vertical slope of the far hollow wall, on ground that no experienced hiker would choose to descend in daylight, let alone in dense fog at 2 a.m. The sound was the sound of something heavy moving through rhododendron without slowing down, without navigating, without the hesitant, crashing, cursing progress of a human being trying to force themselves through dense brush. It simply moved through the vegetation, and the branches broke against it in a low, continuous percussion, and the sound was growing. It was coming down the slope. It was bypassing every switchback on the far trail. It was descending in a direct vertical line through terrain that a person could not descend, moving toward the hollow floor, and then she understood this. She understood this completely and without needing to work it out. Up the near slope and onto the trail where she was standing. She ran. She turned her headlamp off because some deep and wordless part of her understood that the light was the thing it wanted, that the light was the language it had learned, the lure it had mastered, the borrowed tongue it used to speak across dark hollows. And she ran in total darkness on a trail she had only seen in the pale circle of that same headlamp, running on memory and the feel of packed earth under her boots, running by the sound of her trekking poles hitting stone. Behind her, from somewhere down in the hollow, and then closer still, a white LED beam swept through the fog. Not the irregular bobbing beam of a running hiker. A wide sweeping arc, left to right, moving through the trees below the trail, then through the rhododendron at the trail's edge, then along the trail itself, painting the fog with sharp, cold light, hunting the source of the signal it had received. She ran. She ran with her eyes fully open and completely blind, and the beam swept behind her, and the branches of the rhododendron on both sides closed over her head. And she ran. She reached the shelter. She does not know precisely how. The recording captures 11 minutes of her breathing and her footsteps, and in the distance, diminishing but never entirely absent, the sound of heavy movement through brush. And then the recording captures the sound of a metal roof in rain, because the storm had arrived, and the rain was loud on the shelter roof, and eventually the other sounds were gone, or were buried inside the sound of the rain, which may or may not be the same thing. She sat in that shelter for 3 days. The storm lasted 2. She sat for 1 more day after it cleared, while pale October light moved slowly across the shelter floor, and the woods dripped, and the mountain was very quiet. She told the person who found her that she had no memory of being afraid after she reached the shelter. What she remembered was a feeling she could not name precisely, a slow and careful removal, as though something had reached into the place where her certainty about the world was stored and taken one specific, load-bearing thing out of it. She hiked out on the 4th day. She has not returned to the high route. In the shelter log, the pencil-written record that hikers leave in the plastic bag tucked between the boards, she wrote only 1 sentence. Do not signal across the hollow at night. She did not say what would answer. She trusted that the mountain would explain it to them when the time came, in its own way. Sleep well now. You are not on the mountain. You are warm and still, and the only light in your room is the one you chose to leave on. No hollow stretches out beneath your window. No fog moves through the trees outside your door. Whatever is out there on those high, dark ridgelines tonight, it is looking for a signal. So give it nothing. Keep your light close. Keep it quiet. And sleep. Something is in the pipe. Something is breathing in the pipe. There are mistakes a person makes once, just the once, and then they carry the shape of that mistake with them for the rest of their living days. Not as a scar exactly, but as a kind of knowledge that sits permanently below the surface of ordinary thought, the way a stone sits below the surface of still water. You can't see it most of the time, but on certain nights, in certain silences, you become aware of it again. Its weight, its edges, the specific and irreversible nature of having gone down that particular switchback on that particular evening, when every honest part of you was already whispering to turn back. I did not turn back, and that is where this story lives. I want to tell it slowly, because slow is the only way it makes any sense. The Appalachians are not a landscape that rewards hurry. They are old mountains, older than almost anything else on this continent, and they have had a long time to become what they are, a long time to settle their particular silences into place, a long time to decide what lives in them and what merely passes through. I was passing through, or so I believed. The day had begun well enough. I'd set out from the last shelter before the ridgeline in the gray, pale hour just before dawn, when the trail is still cool enough underfoot that you can feel the moisture in the soil through the soles of your boots, and the trees on either side hold the darkness just a little longer than the sky above them. It was mid-October. The maples had already given most of their color to the wind, and what remained on the branches was a dark, wet amber, the last of the season's warmth holding on with a particular, unhurried stubbornness. I had done this stretch before, years ago, though not alone. Memory is a strange trail guide. It tells you the general shape of a thing, the steepness of a particular climb, the way a certain viewpoint opens up without warning, but it withholds the details you actually need. The specific mile marker where your water runs low, the exact way the wind changes character when you gain the exposed ridge and there is nothing between you and the next county but cold air and the sound of your own breathing. I had 2 liters when I started. By mid-morning, with the ridge still an hour above me, and the trail tilting upward through dry, rocky switchbacks where the soil had cracked away from the stone in long, pale fissures, I was down to 1. I told myself it was fine. The guidebook notation was clear. No reliable water sources on the ridge section. Plan accordingly for 11 miles. I had read it that morning in camp, in good light, with a full stomach and both bottles full, and the words had arranged themselves in my mind as a simple logistical note, something to be aware of, categorized and filed and largely forgotten by the time the trail leveled out and the views opened up to the west. But by mid-afternoon, the category had shifted. The ridge was exposed and wind-stripped, and the wind itself was cold and dry, and had been pulling the moisture from everything it touched for what felt like weeks. The bracken fern along the trail margins had gone the color of old rust. The leaf litter was loud underfoot, a dry, papery crackling with every step that seemed to announce my presence to the whole hollow below. My lips had begun to chap at the corners. The back of my throat carried a faint, persistent ache, low and patient. The kind of thirst that has moved past urgency into simple fact. I rationed carefully, small sips, measured intervals. The particular discipline of a person who is trying very hard not to think about how much remains by focusing instead on the exactness of the effort. It didn't help as much as I needed it to. By the time the sky had shifted from the flat, pewter gray of an overcast October afternoon to the deeper, bruised violet of approaching dusk, I had perhaps 3 swallows left. The trail bent northward ahead, following the ridgeline through a section where the mountain laurel crowded in from both sides, dense, pale-barked, horizontal in its reaching. The kind of growth that seems less like a plant and more like an intention. A thicket that has decided on its direction and does not reconsider. I was moving through it, head down, counting steps in the absent-minded way you count steps when the day has gone on long enough that thinking requires more effort than you have available. When I saw the sign, it was tacked to a laurel trunk just at the trail junction, where a faint depression in the slope hinted at a secondary path breaking off to the left and downward. The board was old, dark with moisture and years. The grain of the wood raised and roughened in the way of things that have spent a long time outdoors, being alternately soaked and dried and soaked again. The letters had been burned directly into the surface rather than painted, which meant they were still legible even in the failing light. Deep, clean channels in the wood that held the shadows. An arrow pointing down and left, and beneath it, one word: spring. No mileage, no name, no agency marker or trail club medallion, just the word and the arrow, burned into old board by someone's hand, at some point far enough in the past that the tack holding it had rusted entirely into the bark. I stood at that junction for a long time. Every accumulated piece of trail knowledge I carry, and I have been walking long enough to carry quite a lot of it, assembled itself quietly against the idea of following that arrow. Unmapped source, unknown water quality, unknown distance down a steep, unlighted slope through dense laurel in failing light, alone, with the temperature dropping and the trail narrowing. Every bit of it said, "Keep walking north." I looked at my bottle. The last of the light caught the plastic from one angle and showed me precisely what remained. The thin, honest measure of 3 swallows, with the particular clarity of something that has run out of patience for pretense. I went down. The slope was steep enough from the first step that I had to angle my feet sideways to keep purchase, and the laurel closed in almost immediately. My pack snagged on branches I could not entirely see, Smooth, reaching arms that caught the straps and held briefly before releasing, only to catch again 2 steps further on. The smell changed within the first 20 feet of descent. Above, at the ridgeline, the air had been dry and cold and mineral. The smell of stone and dead bracken, and the stripped-down emptiness of a mountain releasing its warmth for another year. Down here, below the wind line, sheltered by the density of the thicket and the steepening hollow, the air thickened. It grew heavy with damp loam and the dark, sweet rot of decades of composting leaves packed in layers against the slope. There was iron in it, a sharp, clean, mineral edge, like rain on old nails, that told me before I could see anything that water was close. The spring box sat in a small depression where the slope leveled briefly, as though the mountain had exhaled once long ago, and the ground had simply settled into that breath and stayed there. The concrete was old enough to be returning slowly to the landscape around it. Moss colonized the entire upper surface in thick, dark mats of deep green and near black. And at the corners where moisture collected, a pale mineral residue had crystallized in thin, branching patterns like frost. The construction was rough and deliberate, a low, rectangular form, perhaps 3 feet on each side, sunk partially into the earth with a shelf of natural stone projecting above it to keep out debris. Someone had built it with their hands, with stone and poured cement, and the patience of a person who expected to use it for the rest of their life. And then the mountain had resumed the long, quiet business of taking it back. From the rear face of the box, the wall pressed directly against the exposed bedrock of the slope, a single iron pipe jutted forward, 1.5 inches in diameter, perhaps, 8 inches of visible metal before it vanished back into the concrete, and the concrete vanished into the rock. Whatever the pipe continued through beyond that point was inside the mountain. Solid stone and darkness, and a column of iron too narrow to illuminate and too deep to fathom. Water moved from its mouth, clear, thin, moving in a way that was not right. I noticed it, and told myself immediately that I hadn't. That is a thing the mind does in moments of need. It editorializes the evidence before you've had a chance to properly examine it. The water moved in pulses. It slowed. It stopped completely for 3 or 4 full seconds, long enough that I found myself holding my own breath in parallel. Then it resumed, a short, emphatic surge that wet the moss below the pipe mouth in a dark, spreading stain, before slowing again and stopping again. Underground springs do not behave this way. The pressure that drives them is geological, patient, old beyond any human accounting. It does not pulse. It does not pause. It does not surge and withdraw and surge again in a rhythm that resembles, uncomfortably, the rhythm of deliberate breathing. I crouched in front of the box. I took out my bottle. The cap made a small, clean click in the silence of the hollow, and the sound traveled further than it should have. The laurel held very still. Above, between the branches, the sky had gone entirely to the deep violet that is the last thing before dark. I held the mouth of my bottle beneath the pipe and waited. The water stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. The thin thread of it simply ceased, as though something far back in the dark length of iron pipe had closed around it completely, had made a quiet and total decision about the matter. I held the bottle under the dry mouth of the pipe. I waited. The woods waited with me. And then, from deep inside the mountain, not from the concrete, not from the 8 visible inches of rusted iron, but from somewhere far back in the lightless interior of that narrow pipe, from a place that should have contained nothing but pressurized water and cold rock and the absolute indifferent silence of the underground, came a sound, a breath, wet, slow, deliberate, the sound of a throat, a chest, a diaphragm working together in the unmistakable rhythm of something alive drawing air deep into itself. The way a person breathes when they have been dry for a very long time. When the act of drawing breath has become something between relief and suffering. A long, low, rattling pull of air, intimate as a bedside, impossible as the dark interior of a mountain. I did not move. I mean that precisely. My body ceased all voluntary operation without instruction from me. My hand remained beneath the pipe. My face remained close enough to the iron mouth to smell the rust of it, and the wet mineral dark of whatever lay behind it. The laurel did not move. The hollow held itself in a silence so complete it had texture. And then the whisper came. I will not repeat what it said. I will tell you only that it was close, acoustically, impossibly close. The kind of close that carries no distance in it at all, that arrives at the ear as though the mouth producing it is right there, right at the source, with nothing between you. It had traveled through however many meters of black iron and solid bedrock, and arrived without diminishment, without echo, without the reverb of stone or the friction of distance. It simply arrived. I set my bottle down on the moss, without sound, without hurry. I straightened up from my crouch, and I did not look at the pipe again. This is what I have come to understand in the months since that evening, lying awake with the specific quality of that sound still present somewhere at the back of my hearing. What lives in that pipe is not a hunter. It does not pursue. It does not follow you up the switchback or wait in the laurel thicket for your return. It has, perhaps, never left that place at all. It exists precisely at the junction of the deep mountain and the surface, at the point where water is meant to push outward, where the earth is meant to offer something to the living. And it has learned, over whatever long measure of time it has occupied that space, that it does not need to move. It only needs to wait. It waits for the dry season, for the long ridgeline with no reliable sources, for the hiker who read the guidebook notation in good light with a full bottle and filed it away and forgot it until the afternoon had taken everything. It waits for the unmapped sign and the steep switchback and the moment of crouching, face close, the mouth of the pipe just there, the need overriding the older and quieter instruction that says certain openings in the earth are not for us. And in the space between the pulses of water, in those 3 or 4 seconds of complete stillness when the flow stops and the hollow holds its breath, it listens. I climbed back to the main trail in full dark, moving slowly, without my headlamp. I could not have told you then, and cannot tell you now, why darkness felt safer than light in that moment. It simply did. 2 miles north, I found a small creek crossing, unlisted, unmapped, 2 inches of cold water over flat stone, and I sat beside it with my back against a beech tree and filtered 3 liters and drank without rushing. The ordinary sounds of the woods return gradually. A branch settling somewhere in the dark above. The distant, patient drip of water on stone. I did not sleep that night. The spring boxes in that country are old. Older than the trail that passes above them. Some were built over seeps the old families knew, sources they used carefully, with the particular care of people who understood that not everything the mountain offers is offered freely or without condition. There is one, below a nameless ridge, in a hollow where the laurel grows too dense and too close, and the air carries the smell of iron and deep water and time. The pipe juts from the rock. The water pulses and pauses and pulses again. And in the silence between one breath and the next, it is already listening for yours.